Captain Peter Cutsie, South Korea, and this is my briefing room to continue with part 3, all about checklists. Just to take a wee step back, remember that the last item that we were talking about was if a checklist gives you a choice, the pilot monitoring would read both choices and both pilots would decide on which one it was before continuing.
The pilot flying may also direct reference checklists to be done by memory if no hazard is created by such action, or the situation does not allow reference to the checklist. This is probably the single most important part in the entire reference to checklists in the QRH. However, it is not to be a license to do all or many reference items by memory.
So just to repeat that, I don't know how the sound quality came with respect to the PowerPoint voice file, but the pilot flying may also direct reference items, checklist items to be done by memory if no hazard is created by such action, or the situation does not allow a reference to the checklist. We had a good example of that in the cargo fire, where we didn't have memory items, but the captain may have, in that particular case, do the number 1 and number 2 reference items by memory, but not use this as a license, as I mentioned, to do all reference items by memory. Confirm step. The word confirm is added to the checklist items when both flight crew members must verbally agree before the action is taken. During an in-flight non-normal situation, verbal confirmation is required for the following: an engine thrust lever, an engine start lever, an engine or APU or cargo fire switch, a generator drive disconnect switch, an IRS selector when only one IRS has failed, a flight control switch. This does not apply to a loss of thrust on both engines, and you'll know why if you purchase my viewing to my package, my library. I've done an extensive set of videos on this particular non-normal. Confirmation is not needed for completion of a non-normal checklist on the ground. Personally, I want confirmation, but you don't need to do it. If there's no requirement for specific words during a confirm step for physical actions such as touching or pointing to a control, so there's no requirement. Areas of responsibility, ground versus flight. When the airplane is stationary on the ground, the captain and the first officer take action based on each crew member's area of responsibility. During an evacuation, the first officer sets the flap lever to 40. When the airplane is in flight or in motion on the ground, for instance, if you're taxiing, right, in motion on the ground, if the pilot flying, I should say, and the pilot monitoring take action based on the crew member's area of responsibility. After moving the control, the flight crew member taking the action also states the checklist response. Inoperative items. Checklists include an inoperative items table only when the condition of the items is needed for planning the rest of the flight. The inoperative items, including the consequences, if any, are read aloud by the pilot monitoring. The pilot flying does not need to repeat this information, but must acknowledge that the information was heard and understood, such as, check, okay, I understand, continue. Any word that the other pilot understands. Just one particular point I want to mention before we go on to deferred items is that generally you follow your company SOPs, but your iPads or tablets may be in holders on each respective windshield, and the person who's reading pilot monitoring checklist would be looking right, and the pilot flying would be looking left. Caution, who's flying the airplane? So you have to be careful with reading from a tablet or an iPad. Some companies require that the pilot monitoring when reading the iPad or would take the iPad out of the holder and place it in front of him or her so that that pilot monitoring could be monitoring the flight. Be very careful when looking left to a tablet or looking right at the same time. Nobody's flying the airplane. Caution. All right. Deferred items. After completion of the non-normal checklist, normal procedures are used to configure the airplane for each phase of flight. When there are no deferred items, the descent, approach, and normal landing checklists are used to verify that the configuration is correct for each phase of flight. When there are deferred items, the non-normal checklist will include the item checklist complete except for deferred items. The pilot flying is to be made aware when there are deferred items. That's the pilot monitoring's duty. These items are included in the deferred items section of the checklist and may be delayed until the usual point of doing the descent, approach, and landing checklists. The deferred items are read aloud by the pilot monitoring, the pilot flying, or the pilot monitoring takes the action based on the crew member's area of responsibility. After moving the control, the flight crew member taking the action also states the response. For instance, some carriers, and one in particular that I enjoyed working with, in the event of, let's say, an engine separation after V1, when reaching 400 feet, the beginning of the amber zone, the red zone completed, no actions are taken except the odd verbal call of a situation such as engine fire or engine malfunction. If you're not sure of the number, in my case, I would prefer not to hear numbers in case a mistake was made. But once you enter or leave the red zone and go into the amber zone, then any recall items that are required are done. And for instance, let's say the captain was flying and the engine number 2 was separated. The recall items are auto throttle, disengage. Number 2 thrust lever, confirm. pilot flying. Pilot monitoring confirms. Confirm number 2. And the pilot flying would close the engine number 2 thrust lever and say close as he or she is doing it. That is one method. You follow your company SOPs, but that is probably the most popular used by airlines around the world. Deferred items. The deferred items section of the non-normal checklist includes the descent, approach, and landing normal checklists, if more than one of the following occurs. An item is deferred until after the descent checklist. A normal checklist response is changed as a result of the non-normal situation. So use these checklists instead of the normal descent, approach, and landing normal checklists. The pilot flying or the pilot monitoring responds to the deferred normal checklist items based on each crew member's area of responsibility. However, during the deferred landing normal checklist, the pilot flying responds to all deferred normal checklist items. Checklist complete. Each checklist has a checklist complete symbol at the end. 4 squares. The checklist is complete, or the checklist complete symbol can also be in the body of the text. Let me show you an example. Here's one example here, the one that we talked about before with the choices. If in the case it was choice 1, here is end of checklist in the body of the text. If it was choice 2, you carry on with the checklist until you actually came to the part of the checklist at the end. All right. This only occurs when a checklist divides into 2 or more paths where you were given a choice. Many checklists are that way, where you are given a choice. Each path can have a checklist complete symbol at the end, and that last one did. The flight crew does not need to continue reading the checklist after the checklist complete symbol. After completion of each non-normal checklist, the pilot monitoring states, smoke or fumes checklist complete. All right, so let's go into special situations. While every attempt is made to supply a needed non-normal checklist, it is not possible to develop checklists for all conceivable situations. In some smoke, fire, or fumes situations, the flight crew may need to move between the smoke, fire, or fumes checklist and the smoke or fumes removal checklist. So don't be confused and take your time reading. In some multiple failure situations, the flight crew may need to perform several checklists, combine the elements of more than one checklist. So you have to take your time and both agree that you're reading the correct checklist. Consider doing memory items first, followed by the reference steps. That's normal. Upon completion of a non-normal checklist, review all the warning lights, caution lights, and other alerts to determine the need to do other non-normal checklists. When you actually push recall, that's how you can check what is outstanding and what's left, what checklists are left to do. So a clean window on pushing recall indicates that there's nothing left out of anything that has a master caution connection to it. In all situations, the captain assesses the situation and uses good judgment to determine the safest course of action. Troubleshooting. It should be noted that determining the safest course of action, troubleshooting, taking steps beyond the normal checklist, may cause further loss of system function or system failure. As a general rule, do not troubleshoot. Boeing are highly experienced in building airplanes and in training pilots, and the checklists are very detailed and very correct. So don't start inventing your own. Don't troubleshoot. Generally, a good rule is don't do it. Troubleshooting should only be considered when completion of the non-normal checklist results in an unacceptable situation. That's different. So normally this is decided upon between both crew members, but the captain has the final say because he or she has more experience generally. Special situations. Well, every attempt is made to supply a needed normal checklist, it is not possible to develop checklists for all situations. In some smoke, fire, fume situations, the flight crew may need to step back and forth. So we've already covered that. Let's move on to the next. Land at the nearest suitable airport. There are some situations where the flight crew must land at the nearest suitable airport, get the airplane on the ground as safely and quickly as possible is what that means. There are situations, but are not limited to the conditions where the non-normal checklist includes the item plan to land at the nearest suitable airport. Fire or smoke continues is a good reason. Only one AC power source remains, either the engine or the APU. Only one hydraulic system remains. The standby system is considered a hydraulic system. A, B, and standby system. 3 hydraulic systems. If any other situation determined by the flight crew to have a significant adverse effect on safety if the flight is continued. This is experience and airmanship. Immediate landing. It must be stressed that for smoke that continues or a fire that cannot be positively confirmed to be completely extinguished, the earliest possible descent, landing, and evacuation must be done. Engine shutdown. Checklists directing an engine shutdown must be evaluated by the captain to determine whether an actual shutdown or operation at reduced thrust is the safest course of action. Experience. Consideration must be given to the probable effects of running the engine at reduced thrust. Loss of indications. There are no non-normal checklists for loss of system and indications such as flap or engine indications or automatic display of the secondary engine indications. Automatic display of the secondary engine parameters due to oil quantity is for flight crew awareness and does not require pilot action. Continue normal system or engine operation unless a limit is exceeded or a non-normal situation occurs. Assumptions. Non-normal checklists also assume during an engine start and before takeoff, the associated non-normal checklist is done if a non-normal situation is identified after completion of the checklist. The dispatch deviation guide or operator equivalent is consulted to determine if minimum equipment list dispatch relief is available. This is on the ground where you have time to do it and it's safe. You can call your company and get advice. System controls are in the normal configuration for the phase of flight before starting the non-normal checklist. That's very important. If the master caution and system annunciator lights illuminate, all related amber lights are reviewed to assist in recognizing the cause of the alert. Remember, the recall on the glare shield is a great tool and should be used often to ensure you haven't missed a second or third fault. That's why it's there. Oral alerts are silenced and the master caution system is reset by the flight crew as soon as the cause of the alert is recognized. That's so in case another problem occurs, you will get an alert. The emergency position of the oxygen regulator is used when needed to supply positive pressure in the masks and goggles to remove contaminants. The 100% position of the oxygen regulator is used when positive pressure is not needed, but contamination of the flight deck air exists. Continuation of assumptions. Non-normal checklists also assume indicator lights are tested to verify suspected faults. In-flight reset of a trip circuit breaker is not recommended unless directed by a non-normal checklist. However, a trip circuit breaker may be reset once after a short cooling period of approximately 2 minutes. If, in the judgment of the captain, the situation resulting from the circuit breaker trip has significant effect on safety on the ground, flight crew reset of a circuit breaker should only be done after maintenance have determined that it is safe to reset the circuit breaker. So check with your company and make sure. Generally, the rule is don't touch the circuit breaker if it's fault. That's general. Flight crew cycling, that is pulling of or resetting of a circuit breaker to clear a non-normal condition, is not recommended unless directed by a non-normal checklist. Configuration check after an engine start. After an engine start and before takeoff, illumination of a red warning light, an amber caution light, an amber or other indication requires completion of an associated checklist. In certain cases, amber caution lights illuminate during master caution recall to inform the flight crew of the failure of one element in a system with redundant elements. So we've talked about that when I showed you the recall in the simulator. If system operation is maintained by a second element, the amber caution will extinguish when the master caution is reset. In these situations, the amber caution light alerts the flight crew that normal system operation will be affected if another element fails. An amber caution light illuminates during master caution recall, but extinguishes after the master caution is reset. Completion of the associated checklist is not required. This concludes the series, part 1, part 2, part 3 of all about checklists. I hope you enjoy the series. Remember that I'm available for online tutoring and have done so with many pilots around the world. Go to my website at latlonglobalwix.com and have a look at the plans that I offer. Set up a meeting with me free, and we'll set it up on Zoom where I can explain what my library contains, close to 500 files from which you can learn and refresh yourself on the 737. Thanks for watching. Safe flying. Stay passionate about flying and stay professional.